Shoumita Dasgupta is the daughter of Bengali immigrants, a woman of color and STEM, and a scientist, educator, and geneticist. She is professor of medicine and assistant dean of diversity and inclusion at Boston University, a Fulbright specialist, and a member of the inaugural cohort of faculty affiliates at the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. I first came across Shoumita's work when the Beacon republished a piece she wrote for The Conversation entitled "Mass Deportations Don't Keep Out Bad Genes. It's scientific racism that's used to justify xenophobic immigration policies." Well, it turns out Shoumita grew up in Central PA and was childhood friends with our publisher Emily Smith. So for today's special International Women's Day episode of The Signal, Emily takes over the hosting responsibilities and speaks with Shoumita about her work and her new book, Where Biology Ends and Bias Begins: Lessons on Belonging from Our DNA, which was just published in February.
Hi, Shoumita. Welcome to The Signal.
Hi, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start off today by being honest that we've known each other for a long time. We were friends growing up in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania. What was it like for you being a first-generation American whose parents immigrated from South Asia, growing up in such an overwhelmingly white area? And how do you think this experience influenced you intellectually and may have led you down a career path to becoming a professor of genetics?
Thank you for that question. I really think it's an important one because our lived experiences certainly influence how we view the world and our interests and, what we choose to do with our time. In my case, as you noted, I grew up in central Pennsylvania at a time when there were very few immigrants in central Pennsylvania. There are more now, but it's still a predominantly white area. But my parents were some of the original members of the Bengali community in the Camp Hill area. They were often cold called by new immigrants to the area, just opening up the phone book and looking for names that looked familiar. And they would get questions, where's the nearest Indian grocery store? Where's the temple? These kind of basic questions that are really helpful in terms of integrating into your new home. In my case, we had sort of two different spheres in which we navigated. One was this chosen family of other immigrants in the Harrisburg area. And then there was also the white spaces that I navigated for school and sports and other things. So I had to become very adept at kind of switching and figuring out which version of myself I'm putting out in any given context. And the other issue was that it really gave me a lot of context to understand people who are marginalized across a variety of different identity groups. So many of the issues that we faced as an immigrant family that really stood out, in many ways in the local context, there was no hiding our identities. It was written all over our bodies. And that was really a lesson in understanding what it's like to come from any kind of marginalized identity group and struggling to fit in. So that was really sort of the context of my initial experiences in the field. And then, I came from a family of scientists as well, and I was always interested in science growing up. So there was just this natural intersection of understanding our biology and our genomes and what is actually encoded scientifically in our identities in that sense versus what is actually more socially programmed. So that was sort of a journey that I went on as I started exploring my professional interests.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. I think it cannot be understated or cannot be overstated what a small population people of color were in our town growing up and how much that could affect your lived experience. When and why did you decide to write your new book, Where Biology Ends and Bias Begins: Lessons on Belonging from Our DNA? Because quite frankly, the publication couldn't have come at a better time given the dire political moment we find ourselves in.
Well, first I want to say it's not my fault, whatever is happening in the world. I did not engineer it to time and coincide with the release of my book. But I started writing this book about 2.5 years ago, and I was approaching this because I had been teaching a lot of these topics individually in my classroom. And I should share first that I'm a professor of medicine at Boston University, and Boston University is affiliated with the Safety Net Hospital. So it's really the kind of place that people come regardless of their background, regardless of their health insurance status, in order to be treated respectfully and equitably in terms of their healthcare needs. So this is sort of the approach of my whole campus, is the ethos. And I teach medical students and PhD students who are interested in understanding the science of biology and health. So in these different settings, I had been teaching about what biology tells us about sex, how that's different from gender, what biology tells us about ancestry, how it's different from race and ethnicity, understanding the biology of disability, pregnancy. So, thinking about a lot of these different marginalized groups kind of in just-in-time teaching, whatever the students are learning at that moment, what is relevant with respect to the marginalizing forces and the social identities compared to the biological factors. So I've been teaching all of those separately, and then I just started thinking, I really want to kind of bring these all together into a single course so that people who are interested in equity writ large could kind of think about this and identify themes across all of these different areas. So while I was thinking about this as an individual course, I also was approached by the acquisitions editor, Chloe Lehman, at University of California Press. She had seen a few different pieces that I had written about each of these individual topics, and she thought, we really need to have these all in a single book. So it was really just a perfect convergence of factors that happened at the same time, that I was thinking about pulling it all together into a course and at the same time proposing a book structure to house all of that information. And it was a very special experience, really, because it meant I got to workshop the ideas with the first class that I taught. Now, this semester I'm teaching the third round of this class. And that first group, we just had so many free-ranging discussions. We do it every semester, but I have a special place in my heart for the first group. It was a group of all women. We created a really safe space, and we were just open to sharing lots of our own personal experiences and how they were reflected in some of the more scholarly or global experiences that we were talking about in class. So it kind of just came together, just a combination of luck and then also sort of multiple decades of professional experience in these areas just brewing, and it all sort of came together at once.
So your first group was all women?
Yep, that's right.
I can personally say how incredible I know that experience to be, because I was elected to Borough Council in Camp Hill 3.5 years ago, and we were the first all-woman council ever to be elected in the state of Pennsylvania. There's been another election since then, and some of our members are no longer council members, and we no longer have that full women group. And it's a very, very different experience.
There's something special about having a shared identity in the cohort and being able to draw on that.
Yeah. So you describe bias as a virus. Can you explain to listeners why you chose that metaphor?
Yeah, and I will first give a hat tip to my colleague, Brian Donovan, who's described some of the anti-racism and anti-oppression work he does as a vaccine. So it really kind of goes hand in hand with this idea of bias as a virus. And the truth is that, viruses spread through human contact. And bias also spreads in concepts that are learned and talked about, whether they're based on fact or not, ill-informed. And so bias, being a learned behavior, can spread across populations, much like viruses can actually spread across populations.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I guess we should get into some of the nitty-gritty of your book. One of the big things that you talk about is genetic essentialism. Can you explain what that means and the role that it plays?
Sure, absolutely. Genetic essentialism is a shorthand way of describing a scenario where if you notice differences between two populations, you ascribe a genetic rationale or logic behind those differences, when in reality it might actually be related to completely different factors. One of the analogies I use in the book is actually written by Kamara Jones, who's a scholar in public health, and she talks about growing two sets of flowers when she moved into her new house. So she had two planters where one had soil left over from the previous homeowner and the other one was empty. So the one that was left over from the previous owner had sort of rocky, sandy soil, and the new planter she filled with new soil from the garden center, nice fertilized, excellent soil, very nutrient rich. And she took seeds that were genetically identical with the exception of the color of the petals and planted them in both planters. You might not be surprised to know that the seeds that were actually in the nice fertilized soil did better. They started blooming earlier and they were more robust. The ones in the sandier soil didn't look so great. And then you can imagine that as a gardener, when you see the red flowers, in the case were actually blooming very healthily, those were ones that sort of captured her attention. And then she started kind of nurturing them more, watering them better, placing the planter just so in the sunlight. And that's really an allegory or a relation with thinking about structural bias, right? In this case, the gardener is favoring one group over the other. And the pink flowers that were planted in the sandy soil didn't get access to those additional resources and extra care. So if you look at the end outcome, the red flowers, which had access to the extra water, sunlight, better soil, when they did better, a genetic essentialist would say, well, that must be because the genes in the red flowers were better. Whereas somebody who's more aware of all the different things that went into the health of the flowers would recognize that the pink flowers were at a loss from the start, and it wasn't because of their genes. So genetic essentialism is when you make that shortcut and say all the difference can be ascribed to genes, ignoring everything else.
Like redlining when it comes to racism. I always try to describe that to people because I've sold real estate in the past when they don't understand what happened. And then you say, well, for 50 years, people of color weren't allowed to live here, you know, like that makes a big difference on the bigger lots with more grass, with, you know, access to the better schools. And
the other aspect of redlining, I think that's important, is the flip side of that coin, the neighborhoods where people of color were able to actually secure mortgages. Those neighborhoods involved exposure to different toxins or noise or lack of access to playgrounds and, you know, all sorts of different things that can really very directly impact health and other outcomes.
Right. I completely agree with that. So would the Tuskegee experiments, or more recently when the new head of Health and Human Services, RFK Jr., said, quote, we should not be giving Black people the same vaccine schedule that's given to whites because their immune system is better than ours, end quote. Would these be examples of genetic essentialism?
Yeah. So when we're thinking about Tuskegee and we're thinking about differential response to vaccines, there's two issues at play. One has to do with this concept of genetic essentialism, but another is the idea that people are different based on the color of their skin. When we look at racially defined groups, we actually find that people are much more similar than they are different. And in fact, if you look at genetic variation across populations that are racially defined, the vast majority of genetic variation is found within populations. So if you extend to a different population, you only actually observe a tiny fraction of additional variation in a population. And by tiny, I mean single digits percentages. So really the vast majority of genetic variation is within a group. And that means that that group is not homogeneous. So you can't say that the entire group is going to respond a certain way to a vaccine, for instance. You can't make a call that people from a group are different from people from another group biologically. The evidence just isn't there to support that kind of information or that kind of policy making. So really by engaging in policies that treat people differently based on their race and come up with different vaccine schedules, you're actually serving to create a scenario that can really harm people. For instance, if you imagine the message to Black populations being that they don't need vaccines, then suddenly we have an entire cohort of people who are more susceptible to infectious disease. And that is certainly not an equitable health outcome.
Right. I mean, I'm thinking of the other thing that RFK Jr. said when he said that COVID was not Ashkenazi Jews couldn't get it or something like that.
Yeah, same scientific error in thinking. The Ashkenazi Jewish people are not biologically distinct from other groups. What I think people get confused a lot of times because sometimes there are certain specific traits that might have an elevated frequency in a particular group, but that doesn't mean everybody in the group has it. And even though it might be an elevated frequency, it's actually generally still quite low. So these are not the kind of traits that you would see across an entire population, and that doesn't allow the population to be biologically distinct from another.
Yeah, I thought the part that you discussed about white diseases and Black diseases, cystic fibrosis versus sickle cell anemia, like I thought that part was really interesting, describing how there are sickle cell disease can happen across many different populations, even though there's like a larger percentage of them with Black populations. Can you talk about that more?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take the example of cystic fibrosis. With cystic fibrosis, you do see elevated carrier frequencies. That is, people who have one pathogenic variant for the gene. And when they have a reproductive partner who also has that pathogenic variant, they have an elevated risk of having a child who's affected with cystic fibrosis. So the carrier frequencies and the frequencies of people affected by cystic fibrosis are higher in European ancestries. So the frequency of this disorder is higher in white populations, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in other populations. And there's a really famous story about an individual who reached his 50s, a Black man, reached his 50s before being diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, which is normally diagnosed either in newborn screening or in the first decade of life. And in this case, this gentleman was not diagnosed until his 50s. And the reason is because his healthcare providers just could not conceive of a reality where a Black man had cystic fibrosis. They kept misdiagnosing him. They actually accused him of having alcohol use disorder as an explanation for his symptoms, when in reality he simply had cystic fibrosis. Now, the harms of that are he didn't have access to life-saving care and improved health care until his 50s, whereas most people would have access much earlier. And those treatments are really quite effective. So to prevent him from accessing them, it's a very significant cause of health disparities.
I thought that part was fascinating. In your book, you say, quote, sex, a biologically defined variable, is not at all the same as gender, which is individually and socially defined. Can you explain the difference, and can you explain the spectrum of differences beyond the binary?
Absolutely. So sex is a biological characteristic. It describes our sex-specific traits in our bodies, whether those have to do with reproductive organs, chromosomes, or hormones. All of that is under the umbrella of sex. And typically people think of male and female as two important sexes, but there's a whole range of sexes in between those extreme ends of the spectrum. There's a lot of people who have some features of male development and some features of female development, or some folks who just have intermediate features. And so the truth is that intersex people exist. Intersex folks are the ones who have these intermediate features in between male and female. And male sex or female sex by itself is not going to indicate a particular gender identity. So what gender identity we're thinking about: man, woman, boy, girl, agender, non-binary, transgender. These are all different kinds of genders. And so there's a range, again, a full spectrum. And it's not the case that if your body is a male body, then you're going to automatically become a man. That is a more common outcome, but it is certainly not the only outcome.
Yeah, there was one part of your book where you were talking about that I thought was really interesting, about during the growth of a baby, how even if you have, when the cells are splitting, even if you have the right chromosomes going where they're supposed to, that the different hormone pieces might not work right and might make that person be more similar in feeling to a male, even though they have female, or vice versa. And
yeah, so early in development, one of the things that's really notable that many people don't really realize is before birth, we're talking about embryonic development. Regardless of having XX or XY or any other combination of chromosomes, there is a period of time where the embryo will have both precursors for male development and precursors for female development. So it has to follow a developmental switch at some point, sort of a break in the train tracks and making one choice or the other, or proceeding with some aspects of both. And that's normal development. That's what we tend to see happening. So to imagine a reality where the sexes are entirely separate and they don't overlap at all completely ignores that stage of embryonic development.
Right, and that there's no variation across the billions of people born on the planet, right, every day. Yeah, or throughout time. So how does the bias of underrepresentation in science, including with teachers and students, impact research education, practice, knowledge, and delivery. And how will the Trump administration's war on DEI exacerbate this problem of underrepresentation and the problems it creates?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think representation is just such an important aspect of any social community, and science is a social community just like any other community. The kinds of questions that we ask as scientists are necessarily influenced by our lived experiences. We're more aware of things that impact our communities of origin than we may be of other communities. And so, really, setting up diverse research teams allows us to be best poised to identify things that impact the full range of human experience, not just our individual communities. So, representation in scientific teams is incredibly important. There's also a lot of evidence that shows the more diverse the scientific team is, the more impactful the science is. So that allows us to, really think about scientific findings, say they're drugs or tests or anything like that, that are more accessible or more beneficial to a wider range of human populations. So if we stick with individual, the majority representation in scientific teams, we're going to be missing out on all of that. We're just not going to be doing as good science as we possibly could. So eliminating DEI related efforts is actually going to hamstring scientific progress. And that, when we're talking about biology, we're talking about things that impact human health. So this is a really stark and scary kind of consequence of eliminating DEI.
Yeah, I remember another part where you were talking about when to get the best medical health outcomes for patients, a lot of times having a provider who is similar to them in some sort of experience, whether it's a woman having a woman doctor or a similar racial makeup or whatever, that they might have a better health outcome. That would also affect it.
Absolutely. That concordance of identity, it just allows some shortcuts, where the providers can see things that other providers might not even notice. They might know to ask questions that other providers wouldn't know to ask. And also just the reality that they're believed. The patient is believed by the provider. When the provider has a shared lived experience, they know this person is not making this up. This is a real health concern and it's worth following up on.
Another part I want to talk about is this whole eugenics section that you talk about and the way that you combine it with all these 23andMe and Ancestry.com and the genomic research that's out there and these huge databases of information. Can you talk about the pitfalls?
So let me begin by defining eugenics, because that might be a word that not everyone knows. Eugenics is when a group has an idea that a certain trait or set of traits is more desirable, and they ascribe it to a genetic origin. So then they say, well, if we want to have these positive traits in our population, then we should encourage propagation of those traits within families that have the traits and prevent them from propagating in other families. So that's really related to a lot of different movements that have happened in the past and currently. In the past, there were many examples, particularly of Black women being forcibly sterilized for erroneous ideas that there were certain negative traits being transmitted in their families. It wasn't exclusively Black women, but certainly women of color were disproportionately impacted. Now we see things like people talking about bad genes in populations and that we need to actually remove people forcibly from immigration rosters. And that kind of rationale is really the same as the eugenic rationale that we saw in the past. There's also examples of people being forcibly sterilized in ICE detention facilities. So there's a lot of these same echoes of the harms that were done in the past making their way into current policy. And then on the flip side, there's this unusual movement in the United States and elsewhere called the pronatalist movement, where people who are, especially tech billionaires, are really enamored with their own genomes and think that they should actually propagate their genomes to as many offspring as possible. So this is a pronatalist movement that is eugenic in nature as well.
I just found out the other day, because I must have been living under a rock, that Elon Musk has fathered 13 children.
Yes. He is definitely a fan of the pronatalist movement.
Right. And almost none of them were they were almost all in vitro fertilization. So one would imagine that he was doing more than just, he was being selective at the same time.
In fact, yeah, you're right. There are many companies, or not many, but there are some companies who pair that in vitro fertilization with genetic testing of the embryos to allow selection. And some of those companies actually use traits that are not actually very well defined genetically. So when we were talking about genetic essentialism and this idea that there are other factors that can contribute to a certain trait, people who are engaging in some of these embryo selection protocols, they're actually ignoring the influence of things other than genomes, and they're focusing entirely on the genetic signature and assuming that's going to influence the outcome in the child. But really, you would never know until the child is 10, 20, 30 years old if your selection back at the embryonic stage actually did what you thought it was going to do.
Right. Or the influence on the environment around them or their parents or any of the other myriad reasons why a kid ends up a certain way.
Indeed, all the above.
Yes. So I thought it was fascinating because lots of people are sending in their DNA and they're finding out where they come from through this genetic testing. I know in my family, I come from a Northern European Norwegian family. And I know most of my aunts and uncles have gotten the genetic testing. And one of them is very upset to find out that she is part Swedish.
Shocking.
But everyone else is 100% Norwegian. But my one uncle had said he was a little bit from Africa. So
how do these tests work and how does it align with identity? Yeah. So basically what's happening with those tests is that there are reference genomes that are representative of different parts of the globe. And as I mentioned before, there's variation that is seen within populations, and that's the predominant form of variation. But there are some signatures that are more common in particular populations. And so the idea is that if you send in your genome, then they're trying to match up some of those more rare but somewhat more unique or tied to certain regions of the globe. They're looking for those kind of signatures in your genome to see if they can match up where your ancestors may have come from. It's all a game of statistics. So, it's possible to identify all of these variants, or the vast majority of these variants in any population that you look at, but they're just saying, well, it's most commonly found in this part of the world. So your ancestors are probably from that part of the world as well.
Yeah, I mean, we know where they're from, so
right.
We've got the actual cultural history going back generations to know where we come from, which is helpful, so you don't have to rely on, a genetic test for that. But I personally have never gotten that genetic testing because I worry about the privacy problems with putting your information out into a database. Can you talk about what's happening with those big databases?
So I completely hear what you're saying about being concerned about privacy, because me, even as a genetics professor, I've decided not to take advantage of some of these products. And that's just because for my own comfort level, I felt like I didn't want a corporation to have access to my private health information. And in some cases, what people are doing, and of course, is a personal decision about whether or not you want to engage in this kind of product. But what some folks are doing is they are sending in their genomes to be analyzed. And then what you have access to afterwards is you can actually download the data and then re-upload it to a more centralized portal. So the advantage of using a central portal is that it will actually tap people who had their genomes analyzed by a variety of different companies. So that allows you to identify genetic relatives more broadly if genealogy is your thing. The issue about this, though, is that it has actually come to bear that some folks have actually used those genealogical databases to identify genetic relatives of people who have committed crimes. So that means that if you as an individual who has not committed a crime may upload your genetic sequence, then that can actually implicate somebody else who may be a very distant relative that you have no awareness of. But, there's a privacy issue there because now law enforcement is getting access to private health information and making decisions. Now, when it comes to identifying people who have committed violent crimes, it actually seems like potentially a good outcome that you're identifying people who may have gone undetected. But, there's lots of questions and concerns about other potential applications for these databases. And for example, at one point, when migrants were being met at the border and separated from their families, when children were ripped away from their parents, they were taking DNA samples for a while. And one of the ideas was maybe this will help them reunite the families if they choose to. But there's a lot of suspicion around, well, why do you need those DNA samples? Why don't you just keep the families together in the first place? So there's just a lot of questions and concerns about using DNA-based information and how it can be a violation of privacy and what some of the negative outcomes might be.
Especially if we're currently sitting in an administration that doesn't care about anyone's privacy and would also like to get rid of the people that they don't think should be in America, right?
Right. Yeah, and one of the other issues that I came across in thinking about privacy had to do with newborn screening. So with newborn screening, there's a whole list of different genetic conditions that if you identify it at the newborn stage, then you can actually implement important therapies to try to improve the health of the baby who was just born. So newborn screening is an important aspect of early neonatal care for babies. What happens with those newborn samples is they do a heel prick. Maybe some folks remember this for their own babies. There's a heel prick. They put a little spot of blood on a card, and that card goes to a state lab. The state lab will then run the test to identify if the baby has any markers associated with some of these conditions that would then result in their needing some extra treatment. But sometimes state labs actually keep the cards. And so these cards have genetic information. And again, they were using this kind of information to verify a genetic family member of somebody who was suspect in a particular crime. Now, again, thinking about violent crime as a potentially, important reason for help for law enforcement to actually try to pursue some of these avenues. Thinking about the potential impact, though, of using a newborn sample is a significant issue because the newborn, if there's any question about privacy, the parents might choose to say, let's not do the newborn screen. And if that's the case, then a child has one of these conditions that are tested for in the panel, then they're not going to have access to really important health care that is most effective if you actually access it early. The longer you wait, the less good the outcome would be for that baby.
Yeah, I feel like that's the thing with so many different aspects of our expanding technology is that we have so many possible benefits to everything, but in the wrong hands, it can be used negatively, and then there's a backlash, and then we continue down that path.
Absolutely. That's definitely a theme about technology is that we really need people thinking 4 steps ahead and considering what the potential implications would be if it's used incorrectly.
Especially as the technology is exponentially getting better. How do you think 4 steps ahead when it is starting to exceed our own brain power? Right?
Absolutely. That's where I, in some cases, enjoy relying on science fiction writers because they can sometimes imagine things that actually come to be and help us think through what some of the potential societal harms are.
I like Ray Kurzweil. Have you ever read his The Singularity? And
oh no, I'm going to have to go look that up.
Oh my God. There's a documentary too, but he just came out with a new one the first one was called The Singularity is Near, and that was like 20 years ago. And now the new one that I started listening to this summer is called The Singularity is Nearer.
Interesting.
But it's like literally like the test for AI is like he said 2029, and if 2029 is around the corner, and he's like, I'm sticking with it. I think we might get there sooner. And I was like, oh God. Where the computers can fake you out and you don't know that it's a computer.
Right. Yeah. The deep fakes are becoming more and more convincing.
Oh my God. So this episode we're doing this as a special episode because it's International Women's Day. As a woman in technology and you as a woman in science, I feel like we have a lot to say about this because our lived experiences are constantly being in the minority of our fields. So what would you say about that experience of being a woman in science throughout this time?
I think this is a really important observation is that women in science continue to be minoritized. If you look at people at their career stages, the younger or more junior people are relatively reasonably gender balanced, but the further you go along in the career, you see that there's an attrition of representation, particularly of women and of people from other gender expansive identities in the more senior roles, at least in academia and other forms of STEM careers. I can definitely see why that might be the case, because there's a lot of societal barriers to believing women have what it takes to contribute to science. There's disparities in publication rates for scientific studies, and then citation rates for when people reference your studies, accessing funding. All the biases that people harbor play out in these different ways that then contribute to attrition of women in more senior levels of the career. And I think it's really important for us as women to be able to look back behind us, who's behind us, and think about ways that we can help people come up. Because as we talked about earlier, representation and having diverse representation in our teams makes for more higher functioning teams and more interesting science that's more applicable to a broader range of people. So it's really important for us to be considering not only how do we recruit people from all of these different identity groups, but how do we retain them as well.
And merit also includes women, right? Yeah. We also have the merit to have the jobs.
Absolutely.
And I think that is worth saying over and over and over again. Don't count us out. We're smarter than a lot of people think.
Yes.
And very capable, and raising children, right?
That's right.
So the last thing I'm going to ask, your book ends with a call to action with our shared responsibilities. How can a reader who is not a scientist or expert like you help affect change and resist assaults on science after reading this book?
That's a really great question. I think one of the most important things that we can all bring to the table is a sense of humility, that we can all learn from each other. In order to bring that humility, we have to think about ways to use inclusive language, because we don't want to count people out by using harmful language. So these are things that we can all learn, scientist or not, and think about ways inviting people into the conversation. And there are other things that we can do as well. We can support education initiatives that include discussion of some of these complex topics, and thinking about ways to bring more equity into the conversation. That can happen at the school board level. It can happen at the level of stocking your local little free library. I mean, there's things we can all do, and we just have to figure out what our spheres are and where we can most effectively promote change and promote progress.
And how do we do that if Donald Trump says we can't use any kind of equity language to get federal funding?
That's an excellent question as well. And I think that when it comes to, sanitizing language, equity-related language, we still have the ability to put forth ideas around critical thinking. I think a lot of the scientific basis has been misused, and it's in part because people are not looking at the actual evidence critically. The science really speaks for itself. If we help people understand critical thinking, they'll be able to look at the evidence and then come to the conclusion that the evidence supports. But in the absence of that critical thinking, I think, we're going down the wrong path. So even if you're banned from DEI specific topics, critical thinking is a skill that will carry over to helping promote equity as well.
I love that. Well, I want to thank you, Shoumita. And for our listeners, go out to your local bookstore or bookshop.org and buy Shoumita's new book, Where Biology Ends and Bias Begins, Lessons on Belonging from Our DNA. It's been great talking with you, and I hope everyone reads your book.
Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate this opportunity and the chance to catch up.
Awesome.
This has been The Signal, a podcast by the Bucks County Beacon. I'm Cyril McGallego, editor-in-chief and host. For more progressive news, analysis, and opinion from Bucks County and beyond, go to www.buckscountybeacon.com.